Can you show your boobs on Facebook or Instagram? Can you show somebody else's? And what happens when we let the machines make decisions about our bodies? Hi, my name is Chris and I used to be a content moderator for Facebook. Today we're looking at Facebook's rules around nudity and breasts, especially female breasts, and also about the difficulties there are with enforcing these rules. So what happened in this case? Well, it started in October 2020, which in Brazil is known as Pink October, and it's a time when various groups try to raise awareness of breast cancer in women. So this group, they were posting photographs of healthy and unhealthy female breasts to help people understand the difference. They put 8 images, 5 of them showed the nipple and 3 of them had the nipple covered up. Now these were immediately deleted by Facebook. They were auto-deleted. There was no human involved in the decision at all. It was done by computer. Now the user appealed. The review was seen by a computer, not by a human, and so they came to the board to protest. Now this was in December of 2020, so 3 months later. The board agreed to hear the case. They told Facebook, we're going to look into this, and Facebook immediately said, our mistake, and they restored the content. And they argued that because they had restored it, the board didn't need to investigate now. They tried to put a stop to the investigation. Now, if you compare this to the very first case that the board ever took, there was a similar situation where it didn't matter what the board ruled because it had already been taken care of. And the board decided, okay, well, we won't do anything then. And I said, well, you should have done, because this is all about principle. Well, in this case, the board decided that they were going to investigate further. So let's take a look at what happened next. So what is Facebook's policy on nudity? Well, amazingly, Facebook and Instagram apparently have very slightly different policies. And I didn't know that, even though I used to do content moderation for both services. And that's because when we were doing the work, we would have a document called the implementation standards, which is the very detailed rules detailing what you can and can't say or do. And that was the same for both websites. But what you see, the community guidelines, the community standards, these public-facing documents are much simplified versions. And somewhere along the way, there was a bit of detail was lost, with the result that Instagram and Facebook apparently allow slightly different things, even though the people who enforce those rules didn't even know that. So anyway, are you going to allow nudity on your website? Well, for a lot of people, nudity equals sex, and sex leads to pornography and prostitution, and therefore you can't have any nudity on your website at all. And there's a lot of support for this argument. If you look at sites like Craigslist or OnlyFans, you can see that they very quickly become overrun with sexual solicitation, sexual content, the kind of stuff that maybe you don't want on a more generalized website like Facebook. And of course, there are different cultural standards. Some cultures are very conservative and they want to hide the human body. Others want to celebrate the human body much more explicitly and more openly. So you've got to choose which standard you're going to follow. And also, what about the difference between men and women? Are you going to have different standards for different genders? There's a lot of very tricky questions you have to ask yourself here. We also have to consider the question of exceptions to the rules, and there are 2 big ones for Facebook and Instagram. And one is political expression. So for example, if women go out to protest about a male-dominated society, about exploitation and sexual violence, they might want to make a statement saying, like, this is my body, I own my body, I'm going to decide when you see it and when you don't. And they take off their clothes as an expression of freedom, and you can't censor that. So within the boundaries of a political protest, it's okay for ladies to be walking around naked. And the other case is medical context. So if you're talking about breast cancer, for example, well, yeah, you can't do that without showing people images of breasts. So Facebook and Instagram do have an exception in place for these activities. So when we start to look at it, you can imagine that you have to start having some very complex and detailed rules. You have to say, when it's okay, when it's not okay, what about men, what about women, etc., etc. And it gets really complex very quickly. Now imagine I'm not wearing a t-shirt here and I'm a woman if I do this, I'm now revealing a naked breast. What if I just cover the nipple? Well, now, is that a naked breast or not? You need a rule. What if I just partially cover the nipple? Well, is that an exposed nipple or not? What if it's partially covered, but I'm just kind of, being sexy, being stupid? Well, you need to define what's okay and what isn't in just the most excruciating detail. And this leads to a situation where somebody in Menlo Park in California is being paid a 6-figure salary to write ever increasingly complex descriptions of what's okay and what isn't. So the other big issue that we have to think about is human rights. I've hinted at this already, but the big question is, do we treat men and women the same? Is it okay for me to do this? Is it okay for a woman to do this? What's the difference? There's a big argument about objectification, sexualization of women, and then that leads us into censorship. So quite a thorny issue that you have to consider. And having done that and written your rules, well, do we want an AI, an artificial intelligence, to enforce these rules? Because that's what was happening in this case. Facebook say that it doesn't matter and we should focus on the outcome and not the process. What do you think? Now, having made your rules, does it matter if you rely on an artificial intelligence to enforce those rules, or should there always be a human looking at these naked photographs? Now, Facebook argue that it doesn't matter. We should focus on the outcome and not on the method that was used, not on the process. But the alternative argument is that this can lead to over-enforcement, that an AI maybe can't see the nuance, maybe doesn't recognize what's a medical context and what isn't, and therefore is going to be censoring some people, probably women, more than it's going to be censoring others. So if your decisions are being made by an AI, do you want to have some human oversight in the loop? Maybe if your post is deleted, you should get a message telling you it's been done by a machine, and if you want to talk to a human, then this is the process that you have to follow. Now, recently in the UK, a group of drivers for Uber protested that they had been fired by an algorithm, and they went to court to obtain the data that had been used and basically to force Uber to always have a human in the decision-making loop instead of just relying on a computer. Now, I do have a few things to say about the way that Facebook handled this case, starting with this explanation they gave that they didn't have enough content moderators available because of COVID, so they were relying on AI and therefore they've made a mistake. Now, I've been a content moderator. I have worked from home, sat there at my kitchen table with my computer doing the work. The fact that there was a pandemic on doesn't mean that they didn't have the capacity to do the work. And anyway, by October 2020, everybody was back in the office. I know this for a fact. And then they've characterized this as an enforcement error and we fixed it, so it's all okay. Well, guys, if I'm driving down the street in my car and I miss a red light, I make an error and I go sailing through and somebody stops me and says, Chris, you did that wrong. I can't just back up and say, oh, it's all okay now. The harm has already been done, potentially, yeah? And in this case, this was medical information which didn't reach the people that it was aimed at. So there is a real possibility that people were harmed as the result of Facebook's error here. So I don't like the way they've tried to wriggle out of this and push back against the board's authority. In fact, when you say, well, thanks for bringing this to my attention, we've fixed it, you don't need to do anything, you're undermining the board's position. The board is there to have oversight over Facebook and tell them when they've made a mistake. And what Facebook has tried to do is kind of co-opt the board into their review process and take away their power over Facebook. So terrible, really, really bad there, Facebook. Now, these were just my criticisms, but there were a whole bunch more, because when the board announces that it's going to review a case, the general public is invited to comment. And a lot of people wrote in and said the things that I was saying earlier about the exploitation and sexualization of women, the censorship angle, the idea of Facebook deciding what it is that people are allowed to say or not say, and then giving that decision-making power to machines, which leads to over moderation, over censorship. It leads to women's voices being suppressed, and so forth. So there was quite a lot of public concern expressed, although I should add that out of 24 submissions from the general public, only 5 of them came from Latin America. So what was the decision on this one? Well, the board agreed with Facebook that Facebook had made a mistake and that the content was in a valid medical context, so it should have been allowed to stay on the website. So that was all very clear, but the board then went on to make some recommendations about Facebook's use of artificial intelligence. And they said, look, if your AI cannot differentiate between a medical context and pornography, then you need to fix your AI. And if your AI is going to delete people's content without any human intervention, then you need to tell people that that's what's happening. You need to provide some remedy, some mechanism for them to come back and ask for a human to review the case and not solely rely on the machines to do it. So there we have it. The board has exerted its authority over Facebook, given them a slapped wrist for doing things wrong. Facebook has tried to wriggle out of admitting any wrongdoing, and I think that this one has actually turned out very well. Still doesn't resolve the issue of whether you should be allowed to show your boobs on Facebook or not, and I'm sure that you all have opinions about that and about the way this has been conducted. So please do get down in the comments section, tell me what you think, tell me what you think the rules should be and who was right or wrong in this case, and I will go away, start researching the next one, and I'll talk to you next week. Now, one more thing. At the bottom of this report, the board says something really important. They say these recommendations should not be implemented in a way which would undermine content moderators' right to health during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they're referring to this idea that there's nobody in the office because of COVID-19, therefore we're using AI. And now we're telling you to stop using AI, which means bringing everybody into the office and maybe endangering them. What they don't know is that everybody was already in the office at this time. Now, in October 2020, there was a huge fight here in Dublin between the contractors and the company that was hiring them because they were being forced into the office. And I personally obtained video and audio, which I then passed on to journalists, where this was discussed in internal meetings. So I know for a fact that what Facebook was telling the board was actually not true.